Everyone laughed when a poor black boy said he dreamed of Harvard, until a Harvard dean showed up, asking for him by name. Malik Johnson sat alone in the quiet classroom, sunlight streaming through the tall windows and casting soft shadows across his worn notebook. The title at the top of the page stood boldly, "Why Harvard Needs Me." For most, it might have sounded like wishful thinking. For Malik, it was a lifeline, a chance to reach beyond the cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights of his neighborhood. While his mother, Denise Johnson, scrubbed hospital floors just to keep food on the table, Malik dreamed of lecture halls and ivy-covered buildings. But not everyone shared his hope. Ms. Veronica Blake, the advanced English teacher, paused as she walked past Malik's desk. Her eyes narrowed when she spotted the title of his essay. Her heels clicked to a halt, and with a tone dipped in sarcasm, she said, "Harvard, know your place, Malik?" The words cut like glass, and she made sure every student in the room heard them. From the back of the room, Brandon Keller and Troy Hamilton, both sons of wealth and family connections, chuckled. "Maybe they need someone to mop the dorm floors," Brandon added, with a smirk, loud enough to draw more laughter. Malik didn't rise to the bait. He simply gathered his papers with calm hands, slid them into his backpack, and stood. His back remained straight, his chin lifted. He gave Ms. Blake a respectful nod and said softly, "Thank you for your feedback." Then he walked out, not with defeat, but with quiet defiance. What no one in that room realized was that this 16-year-old boy, mocked and dismissed, would soon draw the attention of someone far beyond their narrow expectations, someone with the power to change his future. Later that afternoon, just a few miles away, Denise Johnson was mopping the corridor at Mercy General Hospital. Her feet ached and her back was sore, but when her phone buzzed with a simple text from her son, "Rough day," she paused. She didn't need a full explanation. She knew that tone. She knew that weight. And she knew, deep in her heart, that her son had just been told again that his dreams were too big. She wiped the sweat from her brow, but her expression was firm. They had come too far, survived too much, for her son to be made small. What the world saw as an ordinary school day was, for Malik Johnson, the beginning of something much greater, and no one, not Ms. Blake, not Brandon Keller, not even Malik himself could predict just how far that essay would take him. The next morning, the halls of Lincoln High felt colder than usual. Malik Johnson walked in with his shoulders squared and backpack slung tightly over one arm. Though yesterday's humiliation still echoed in his mind, he pushed forward. He always had. But as he slid into his desk, he noticed something strange. His classmates' eyes avoided his, and the room carried an odd silence. Brandon Keller whispered something to Troy Hamilton and snickered, their eyes flicking briefly to Malik. Then came the moment he had been dreading. Ms. Veronica Blake stepped into the classroom, lips pressed thin and clipboard in hand. "Before we begin," she said with exaggerated cheer, "I'd like to read an example of ambition." She held up Malik's essay. Malik froze. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't warned him. Ms. Blake cleared her throat, then began reading aloud in a mocking tone. "Why Harvard Needs Me." She paused, looking around the room for effect. Quite a bold title, wouldn't you say? Some students laughed nervously, others looked down. Malik's ears burned. He could feel every eye on him. As she read snippets of his work, his dreams, his dedication, his love for his mother, she twisted each line just enough to make it sound naive, even ridiculous. I come from a place where excellence isn't expected, but I strive anyway. She read slowly, then chuckled. Poetic, Mr. Johnson, but Harvard. Really? The final bell rang, mercifully. Malik didn't move. Neither did anyone else. In the back of the room, Alicia Moore clenched her jaw. Her pencil snapped quietly under the pressure of her fingers. She'd had enough. As Miss Blake turned to write on the board, Alicia raised her hand. Yes? Ms. Blake asked. I think you owe Malik an apology, Alicia said firmly. Gasps rippled through the room. Miss Blake turned slowly. Excuse me. You humiliated him, Alicia said. That wasn't teaching, that was cruel. The room held its breath. Mrs. Blake's face darkened. Detention. Today. After school? Malik opened his mouth to object, but Alicia cut him off with a glance that said, Let me. After class, Malik caught up with her near her locker. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Alicia said, shutting her locker with a click. You're not the only one who believes in your future. For the first time that day, Malik smiled. Not because the ridicule was over, it wasn't, but because he realized he wasn't as alone as he thought. The following week at Lincoln High moved at a crawl. Malik Johnson kept his head down, but the damage from Miss Veronica Blake's public mockery had already spread like wildfire. Whispers followed him down hallways. Snickers echoed when he passed. Even some teachers seemed to treat him differently now, as if the mere mention of Harvard in his essay had marked him as delusional. One afternoon, during a lunch break he had chosen to spend in the library, Malik sat alone at the far corner table. His sandwich remained untouched. Instead, he stared down at a torn corner of notebook paper filled with scholarship deadlines and essay prompts. Everything suddenly felt pointless. That's when Mr. Samuel Hartley, the school custodian, walked by, pushing a mop bucket. His usual route never came near this table, but today he paused. Library's quiet today, Mr. Hartley said, his voice low and kind. Malik gave a slight nod, but didn't look up. Mr. Hartley hesitated, then sat on the bench across from him, careful to stay respectful of the space. You know, back when I was in school, a teacher told me I wasn't the college type either. Malik finally looked up. Really? Oh yeah, Mr. Hartley chuckled softly. Said I should think about working with my hands. Funny thing is, I do work with my hands now, and I'm proud of it, but not because I had to, because I chose to. Malik listened, surprised. What she did to you last week wasn't right, Mr. Hartley continued. Reading your essay like that? That wasn't about helping you learn. That was about putting you in your place. Malik's shoulders tensed. It worked. Only if you let it, Mr. Hartley said gently. Listen, son, sometimes the world tries to clip your wings before you've even learned how to fly. But don't you dare give them the satisfaction. You've got something rare. I see it in the way you carry yourself. The way you write. And if you keep pushing, keep showing up, they won't be able to deny it. Malik blinked hard. No one had spoken to him like that in days. Maybe not ever. Mr. Hartley stood, adjusted his worn cap, and smiled. You keep at those dreams, Malik. Don't let anyone make you feel small for aiming big. Malik watched him walk away, mop bucket squeaking along the tiles. For the first time since that humiliating morning, something inside him stirred. Not anger, not shame, but a flicker of belief, the kind that grows slow and steady, even in the darkest corners. The next morning, Malik Johnson arrived at school with a quiet determination. The words Mr. Hartley shared with him still echoed in his mind. He didn't feel fully confident yet, but he felt steadier, stronger, as he passed Mrs. Veronica Blake's classroom. A few students glanced up from their phones, ready for their morning dose of ridicule. Malik didn't flinch. He just kept walking, head high. Later that afternoon, in the computer lab, students gathered for college prep. Some were printing resumes, others were browsing scholarship sites. Malik sat at a terminal, scanning the Harvard admissions portal, when a voice cut through the hum of machines. "Well, look who's still chasing fairy tales," Brandon Keller said loudly, striding in with his usual swagger. A few nearby students chuckled. Troy Hamilton trailed behind him, smirking. Malik didn't respond. He turned back to the screen and clicked open another application tab. Brandon leaned on the edge of Malik's desk. "You really think Harvard wants essays from janitors' kids? Come on, man. Just apply to community college and call it a day." Malik finally turned. Better to aim high and fight for it than stay small because you're scared to try. That silenced the room. Even Troy looked uneasy. Brandon scoffed and backed off, muttering something about people who didn't know their place. But the damage was done, not to Malik this time, but to Brandon's illusion of superiority. Just as the tension began to lift, Alicia Moore approached Malik's station. Her voice was calm, but firm. "That was brave. You shouldn't have to deal with people like that." Malik shrugged, still unsure how to react to kindness in a place that had given him so little of it lately. Alicia glanced at his screen. "You're applying to Harvard?" "I'm trying," Malik said softly. "I think that's amazing," she replied. "I'm applying to Columbia. Maybe we'll both end up somewhere people didn't expect." They exchanged a smile. It was small, but real, the kind of quiet connection that reminded Malik he wasn't entirely alone in this building. As the bell rang and students filed out, Malik sat back and stared at the blinking cursor on his essay. He deleted a sentence, rewrote it. For the first time in days, the words flowed more freely. Not because he wanted to prove anything to Ms. Blake or Brandon Keller, but because he owed it to himself to tell his story truthfully. It wasn't just an application anymore. It was a declaration. He would not be defined by other people's limitations. He would not let their narrow expectations become the bars of his cage. The day after the computer lab confrontation, Malik Johnson felt a shift, not just in how others looked at him, but in how he looked at himself. For weeks, he had swallowed back his thoughts, his anger, his dreams. But now, something had cracked open. He wasn't sure where the courage had come from, but he wasn't letting it go. That afternoon, after school, Ms. Veronica Blake called him to her classroom under the guise of discussing his progress. Malik entered cautiously, sensing this wasn't about grades. She sat behind her desk, arms folded, the same tight-lipped expression that always made him brace for impact. "I saw your name listed on the Harvard portal," she said, her tone sharp. Malik nodded, standing straight. "Yes, ma'am, I'm applying." She tilted her head as if amused. "You do understand the caliber of students they accept, don't you?" "Yes," he said, not flinching. "And I believe I have something to offer." Ms. Blake gave a dry laugh. "Malik, this isn't about dreams. It's about reality. You should be realistic. Maybe a trade school or a local college. Harvard is ambitious. Sometimes ambition is misplaced." For a moment, Malik said nothing. Then calmly he replied, "With all due respect, ma'am, I think I get to decide where my ambition belongs." She stared at him, caught off guard by his assertiveness. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked out, each step steadier than the last. It wasn't rebellion. It was clarity. Later that evening, he returned home to find his mother, Denise Johnson, folding laundry on the couch. She looked up and smiled. "You're quiet today. Everything okay?" Malik sat beside her, feeling the weight of the day in his shoulders. "Ms. Blake said, Harvard isn't for people like me." Denise's hands froze mid-fold. Then, slowly, she reached over and rested her palm on his. "You are exactly the kind of person who should go there," she said. "They need your voice, your story. And if they can't see it, that's their loss, not yours." Malik nodded, trying to hold back the sting in his eyes. His mother added, "Your father would have told you the same thing. He believed in you long before you even knew what Harvard was." At that, Malik looked toward the old photo on the shelf. Dr. Leonard Johnson, smiling in his white coat, holding a baby Malik in his arms. The man who had once walked the halls of Harvard Medical and dreamed his son might one day do the same. That night, Malik sat at his desk and returned to his essay. But this time, he didn't just write for admissions officers. He wrote for his father. He wrote for his mother. He wrote for himself. The next day at school, word about Malik Johnson's confrontation with Ms. Blake had started to ripple through the student body. Some were surprised, others amused, but a few were deeply moved. One of them was Alicia Moore. Alicia had always admired Malik from afar, not for his grades or quiet demeanor, but for the way he carried a quiet fire inside him. She remembered seeing him in the library late at night, headphones in, buried in books, while others gave up and went home. Now, that fire was finally showing. At lunch, Alicia approached him in the courtyard. Malik was sitting alone, going over his essay draft, scribbled notes crammed in the margins. "Hey," she said gently, sliding into the seat beside him. Malik looked up, surprised. "Oh, hey. I heard what happened yesterday," Alicia said, lowering her voice. "That was powerful. I mean, what you said to Ms. Blake." Malik shrugged. "She made it clear what she thought of me." "Maybe," Alicia replied, "but you made it clear what you think of yourself, and honestly, that matters more." There was a pause. The wind picked up, rustling leaves across the table. "I've been watching," she continued, "not in a weird way. I've seen how hard you work. I know what people say about you. Some think you're too serious. Others act like you don't belong. But I see someone who shows up no matter how hard it gets. That's strength." Malik didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not a teacher, not a friend. It was always judgment, assumption, or silence. This felt different. "You really think I have a shot at Harvard?" he asked. Alicia smiled. "I think they'd be lucky to have you." For the first time in days, Malik chuckled. "Thanks. That means a lot." Before the bell rang, she said, "Let me know if you ever want someone to read over your essays. I'd love to help. And for what it's worth, you're not alone in this." That afternoon, Malik stayed after school to meet Mr. Samuel Hartley, the school custodian who had been quietly mentoring him over the years. Mr. Hartley had once been a civil rights activist, now a quiet observer of the world around him. But he saw everything, especially the way Malik moved through the halls with the weight of expectation on his shoulders. "You're standing taller these days," Mr. Hartley said, handing him a folder of scholarship resources. Don't lose that. Malik nodded. I had a conversation today, and it reminded me I don't have to carry this alone. Mr. Hartley smiled. That's how change begins, son. Not with noise, but with steady steps. And with that, Malik felt something shift again, not just in his world, but in the hearts quietly aligning with his journey. The following week brought an unexpected announcement that stirred excitement and nerves throughout the senior class. The school would be selecting one student to represent River Grove High at the statewide Academic Excellence Conference. The opportunity would include a scholarship interview panel, workshops with Ivy League admissions counselors, and national press coverage. For Malik Johnson, it felt like a door swinging open and possibly slamming shut just as fast. The selection process would include a written personal statement and a teacher recommendation. Malik immediately began drafting his essay. But there was one requirement that gave him pause. The teacher recommendation had to come from someone teaching a core subject. That meant only one person could write it, Miss Veronica Blake. He stared at the form for hours that evening, flipping it over in his hands like it might suddenly offer a better answer. His mother, Denise Johnson, watched him from the kitchen table, her hands still wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. You don't have to ask her, Malik, she said quietly. I know, he replied. But if I don't, I'm out. Denise stood and walked over, placing her hand on her son's shoulder. Sometimes the hardest doors to knock on are the ones with the power to change everything. The next morning, Malik waited until the final bell of the day. Students rushed out, but he lingered near Ms. Blake's desk. She looked up, clearly surprised to see him. Yes? He held out the recommendation form. I need a letter. For the Academic Excellence Conference. There was a long silence. Ms. Blake didn't take the paper. Instead, she stared at him, arms folded. Why come to me, Mr. Johnson? Surely there's someone else. Malik stood his ground. Because I want to earn this the right way, and you're the teacher for my core class. That hasn't changed. Something flickered in her eyes. It wasn't softness, not yet, but recognition. She took the form without a word and nodded slightly. You'll have it by Friday. Malik thanked her and turned to leave, his heart pounding. He didn't know if she would write a glowing recommendation or just fulfill the minimum, but it didn't matter now. He had chosen to walk through that door. Later that evening, Ms. Blake sat in her dimly lit kitchen, rereading the form. She thought about Malik, how he had never once missed an assignment, how his arguments in class were always razor-sharp, how, despite everything, he had asked her. She pulled out a blank page, took a breath, and began writing. The week wore on slowly. Malik Johnson went about his days with quiet determination, unaware of what Ms. Veronica Blake was writing behind closed doors. When Friday arrived, he found an envelope slipped into his locker with his name neatly printed in block letters. No note. No signature. Just the letter. He carried it home, hesitated before opening it, then finally slid the paper out with trembling hands. As he read Ms. Blake's words, his breath caught. She didn't just write a recommendation, she wrote a revelation. Malik Johnson is the kind of student educators dream of having, but often fail to see clearly. I confess that I didn't see him at first. I looked past his steady work, his insightful comments, his leadership in class. I allowed assumptions to cloud my judgment. But Malik proved me wrong not through confrontation, but through character. He showed me that true excellence speaks quietly and steadily. And I listened. I am proud to recommend him without hesitation. Malik read the letter 3 times, each time slower than the last. His mother stood nearby, silent until she noticed his eyes glistening. "She really saw you, didn't she?" Denise whispered. He nodded, too moved to speak. Something in that letter went beyond academic praise. It was an acknowledgement of the road he had walked just to be seen. At school, word of Malik's nominations spread quickly. Some students were surprised, others were inspired. Alicia Moore clapped him on the back. "Knew you'd make waves eventually," she said with a grin. Even Brandon Keller, usually smug and dismissive, offered a nod in the hallway. Small gestures, but meaningful ones. A week later, Malik stood at the conference registration desk, name badge around his neck, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The room was filled with brilliant students from across the state, some dressed in tailored suits, others with resumes thicker than textbooks. But Malik belonged there. He knew it now. In one of the workshops, a university admissions officer scanned the room and said, "We're not just looking for the smartest student. We're looking for the student who had to fight to get here." Malik smiled. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't need to. He carried that truth in his posture, in his story, in the words of a teacher who had once overlooked him and had then found the courage to see him fully. That night, under the lights of the city skyline, Malik sat alone on a hotel balcony, letter in hand, wind brushing his cheeks. He whispered, "I'm here, Dad. I made it." And in the quiet, he felt the presence of his late father, Dr. Leonard Johnson, like a steady warmth in his chest. Malik Johnson stood in the hallway of Riverdale University's admissions office, holding his acceptance letter like it might vanish if he let go. The envelope was still creased from how tightly he'd gripped it when he tore it open the day before. A full academic scholarship, room and board. Research opportunities. His name, Malik D. Johnson, printed in bold. He had dreamed of this day for so long that it almost felt unreal. When he stepped outside, the spring air was cool and crisp. His mother, Denise Johnson, waited on the steps, eyes already filled with tears, even before he said a word. "I got in," Malik said, voice barely above a whisper. Denise clutched him so tightly he could barely breathe. "I knew it," she said through tears. "Your father would be so proud." That night, the house was filled with laughter, with the smells of Denise's best cooking collard greens, baked mac and cheese, and Malik's favorite, sweet potato pie. Ms. Veronica Blake even stopped by with a bouquet of wildflowers and a card handwritten in blue ink. But the celebration didn't stop Malik from doing what he knew he needed to do next. The following morning, before sunrise, he walked to the cemetery with a small folding chair and his father's old pocket watch in his hand. He sat beside Dr. Leonard Johnson's headstone, the morning dew soaking through his jeans, and started talking. "Hey, Dad," he said, voice soft but steady. "I made it. Riverdale University. Full ride." He paused, letting the words sink into the quiet. "It wasn't easy. Some folks didn't believe in me, some still don't, but I kept pushing. You and Mom taught me that, and you know what's wild? Mrs. Blake, she's the one who wrote the letter that got me noticed. The same teacher who once looked right through me. Crazy, huh?" He smiled to himself. "I wish you were here to see it. I really do. But I feel you somehow. Every time I want to give up, it's like I hear your voice telling me, "Keep going, son." And I do. Malik sat for a long time, watching the sun rise above the trees, letting the stillness fill him with something strong, something sacred. Back at school, word spread quickly about Malik's scholarship. For some students, it shattered their assumptions. For others, it lit a spark. Alicia Moore, always Malik's quiet supporter, started a student blog featuring unheard voices. Troy Hamilton and even Brandon Keller began participating in service projects they once mocked. Rivergrove High was changing not because Malik demanded it, but because he showed what was possible when someone refuses to be small. Malik sat in silence, staring at the invitation in his hands. It was a formal letter from Dean Thomas Grayson himself, inviting him to the final round of interviews for the prestigious Harvard Scholars Initiative. For most students, this would be the culmination of years of dreams. But for Malik, it felt like a moment he wasn't sure he was allowed to enjoy. The cafeteria bustled around him, but his thoughts were far away. Alicia Moore slid into the seat across from him, noticing the expression on his face. "Hey," she said gently, "you look like you just saw a ghost." He gave her a weak smile and held up the letter. "It's happening. They want me to come up for an in-person interview." Alicia's eyes widened. "That's incredible, Maliki. This is what you've worked so hard for. Your grandfather would be so proud." That name, his grandfather, still carried weight in his chest. Dr. Leonard Johnson had always believed in him, even when no one else did. Malik could still hear his words, calm and steady. "People will doubt you because they don't know you. Your job is to show them who you really are." Mrs. Marlene Winters, the school librarian, had also caught wind of the invitation and left a note for Malik to stop by her office after lunch. When he arrived, she greeted him with her warm, familiar smile and handed him a worn leather notebook. "Your grandfather used to write in this when he was your age. I think he'd want you to have it now." Malik held the notebook carefully, almost reverently. Flipping through its pages, he saw sketches, quotes, and thoughts that mirrored his own in many ways. One entry read, "Never let their expectations define your path. Let your character speak louder than their assumptions." As he left the library, Malik felt a strange mix of calm and nervous energy. The final interview was just days away, and he knew Principal Raymond Grant and Ms. Linda Peterson were already writing their recommendation letters. But Ms. Veronica Blake still hadn't acknowledged the invitation. In fact, she had barely looked at him since the news broke. It was as though she couldn't reconcile the image of that boy from the wrong part of town with a student now standing at the doorstep of Harvard. That evening, Malik sat at the kitchen table with his mother, Denise. She reached across and held his hand. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Malik. You've already shown the world what you're made of." He nodded slowly. Maybe this next step wasn't just about the scholarship or Harvard. Maybe it was about finally embracing that he belonged in every room his effort had earned him. And as he packed the notebook and the invitation into his bag, Malik whispered to himself, "I'm ready." The day of the Harvard interview had finally arrived. Malik stepped off the train in Boston, his palms slightly sweaty, but his back straight with purpose. Franklin Turner's old watch ticked steadily on his wrist, a quiet reminder of the generations who came before him. Malik wasn't just carrying his own hopes, he was carrying the legacy of his grandfather, Dr. Leonard Johnson. Dean Thomas Grayson greeted him personally in the mahogany-paneled conference room. "Mr. Johnson," he said with a firm handshake, "we've heard a great deal about you, from your work ethic to your community involvement." "Your file is impressive." Malik offered a respectful nod. "Thank you, sir. It's an honor to be considered." Across the room sat a panel of faculty, including Dr. Lorraine Adler and 2 other scholars. They reviewed his academic performance, asked thoughtful questions about his goals, his upbringing, and even his experience at River Grove High. Malik spoke with quiet confidence, his voice never wavering. He talked about mentorship, about being underestimated, about the quiet strength of his mother Denise, and about the unlikely wisdom he had gained from the school janitor, Mr. Samuel Hartley. But then came a curveball. One professor leaned forward. "Malik, we recently received a letter from your former teacher, Ms. Veronica Blake. She expressed reservations about your readiness for Harvard. Would you care to comment?" Malik's chest tightened. He hadn't expected that. He paused, took a breath, and met the professor's eyes. "With respect," he said calmly, "Ms. Blake taught me a valuable lesson. Sometimes the people who doubt you the most give you the strongest reason to believe in yourself. I didn't grow up with a silver spoon, but I did grow up with resilience. I know how to show up even when I'm not expected to succeed. That's why I believe I'm ready for Harvard, not because I have all the answers, but because I've spent my life learning how to find them." There was a brief silence. Then, "Doctor." Adler gave a small nod and jotted something in her notebook. Later, as Malik walked through Harvard Yard, he let the weight of that moment sink in. He had told the truth. Not the polished, rehearsed version, but the honest one, and that was enough. That evening, he called his mom. "How'd it go?" Denise asked. "I told them who I am," he said simply. "Now it's in their hands." Back at River Grove, Alicia waited with bated breath. Mr. Hartley, in his quiet way, looked out the window and smiled. He knew Malik had done more than just attend an interview. He had planted his flag and merit on courage, on legacy. Harvard would have to decide, but Malik already had. Just a week after the interview, Malik sat quietly at the kitchen table, a crimson envelope from Harvard resting in front of him. The morning sun filtered through the window, casting long rays across the table. His fingers trembled slightly as he stared at the embossed logo. He hadn't dared to open it yet, not without his mother. Denise walked in, drying her hands on a towel. When she saw the expression on her son's face and the unopened letter, she paused. "Well," she said, trying to keep her voice light, "you planning to stare it into opening?" Malik gave her a weak smile, then looked back down at the envelope. His heart was pounding. Slowly, carefully, he peeled it open. He unfolded the letter inside and began to read. At first, he didn't react. But then, his breath caught, his lips parted slightly, and his eyes welled with tears. He looked up at his mother, holding the letter in both hands like it was made of gold. "I got in," he whispered. "Harvard said yes." For a moment, Denise said nothing. Then, in a blink, she was across the kitchen, pulling him into her arms. "Oh, baby," she said, her voice shaking. "You did it. You really did it." Malik nodded, overcome with emotion. "All the nights, all the times I wanted to give up," he said. "It was worth it." They sat there together in the quiet morning, the weight of years lifting off their shoulders. Malik thought about the janitor who had believed in him when no one else did, the teachers who had doubted him, and the classmates who had laughed. And he thought about his father, the man whose name he carried and whose footsteps he now hoped to honor in his own way. Later that afternoon, Malik returned to school to tell Mr. Hartley. The old janitor was mopping the hallway, humming an old soul tune. "I've got news," Malik said, a wide smile on his face. Hartley leaned on his mop and raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Harvard?" Malik nodded. The older man grinned. "I told you, son, you weren't meant to stay in the shadows forever." Malik's eyes were sincere. "I wouldn't have made it without you." Hartley waved a hand. "All I did was remind you of who you already were." As Malik walked away, a few students peeked out from classrooms. This time they weren't laughing or whispering. They were watching with something closer to admiration, maybe even respect. And for the first time, Malik didn't feel like he had something to prove. He just felt ready for whatever came next. Graduation day at Westbridge High came with the scent of blooming magnolias and the sound of distant trumpets rehearsing for the ceremony. Malik Johnson stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his cap and gown, the maroon fabric heavy with meaning. Denise watched from the doorway, her eyes already glistening with pride. "You look just like your father did," she whispered, voice catching, only taller. "And more stubborn." Malik chuckled softly. "Hope that means I'll make him proud too." Downstairs, the house buzzed with quiet excitement. Alicia Moore was already waiting outside in her own cap and gown, holding a camera. The two had grown close, bonded, through struggle, truth, and perseverance. She gave him a playful shove when he stepped out. "I told you from day one you were Harvard material," she said. "Took you long enough to believe it." At the ceremony, Malik walked across the stage with steady steps. The crowd erupted in applause, but it wasn't just the routine cheer for every graduate. This one was different. Faculty members nodded with newfound respect. Students who once ignored him clapped like they knew they were witnessing something important. Principal Grant handed Malik his diploma with a firm grip and a proud smile. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "we're all better for knowing you." But it was what came after the ceremony that would leave the deepest imprint. At a small gathering outside the school, a stage was set for the Senior Honor Awards. One by one, students were called up for excellence in academics, service, and leadership. Then came a pause. The MC looked out over the crowd and announced the creation of a brand new award, the Leonard Johnson Memorial Scholarship, named in honor of Malik's late father. Malik's heart froze. Dean Thomas Grayson stepped to the mic. This scholarship is awarded to a student who exemplifies quiet courage, intellectual excellence, and resilience through adversity. It is only fitting that its first recipient is Malik Johnson. As Malik walked up to accept the award, his hands shook, not from nerves, but from the overwhelming sense that the story had come full circle. The very name that once made him feel invisible now gave him strength. Standing there, he looked out at the crowd, at his mother beaming through tears, at Mr. Hartley nodding solemnly from the back, at Alicia clapping like her life depended on it. "I accept this," Malik said into the microphone. "Not just for me, but for every kid who was told they weren't enough. For every voice that went unheard. And for my father, who showed me how to walk with dignity even when the world wasn't watching." The audience stood in unison. And for Malik Johnson, the shadows were no longer his story. The spotlight was. The days following graduation brought a quiet stillness to the Johnson household. The once busy kitchen table, filled with scholarship letters and college brochures, now bore only a Harvard acceptance folder and a vase of fresh lilies. Malik spent his mornings reading on the porch, his mind halfway between the present and what lay ahead in Cambridge. One afternoon, as the Georgia sun filtered through the trees, a letter arrived addressed to Ms. Veronica Blake. It was from the River County School Board. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling. It was official. The investigation had concluded. Her discriminatory conduct, once protected by tenure and silence, had been formally acknowledged. While she would not be dismissed immediately, her teaching privileges were suspended for the coming academic year, pending further review and mandatory retraining. It was a quiet reckoning. No newspaper headline, no courtroom drama, just a thin envelope that forced her to sit down and face her reflection in the silence. Meanwhile, Mr. Samuel Hartley was honored in a local ceremony hosted by Principal Grant and the PTA. The school community, once blind to the wisdom in his words, now stood in gratitude. Alicia gave the speech. He didn't just sweep our hallways, he swept away fear, planted hope, and reminded us that courage doesn't always wear a suit and tie. Malik sat in the front row, clapping hard enough that his hands stung. When he later approached Mr. Hartley, the older man simply smiled. "I told you, the truth would come around in its own time," he said. "Now, it's your job to carry it forward." Across town, Brandon Keller and Troy Hamilton had faded into the background. Their families, once perched atop the social ladder, had to grapple with a new reality. No more whispers of entitlement. No more immunity from consequence. As summer deepened, Malik began volunteering at a youth center, mentoring kids who reminded him of his younger self, brilliant but overlooked. One boy, in particular, caught his attention. Jamal, a seventh grader with big eyes and bigger questions. "I want to be like you," Jamal said one day. Malik crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Don't be like me. Be better. Start sooner. Speak louder." And so, the boy who once sat silent in the back of Ms. Blake's classroom was now a voice for others. The final Sunday, before Malik's departure for Harvard, River Grove held a community potluck. Denise made her famous sweet potato casserole, and Miss Peterson from the library brought a handmade journal with Malik's initials embossed on the cover. Before the night ended, someone handed Malik a microphone. He looked out over the people who had shaped him, the ones who doubted him, the ones who believed in him, the ones who made both matter. "I leave tomorrow," he began, voice steady, heart full. "But I don't leave behind what we built here. I take it with me. Every lesson, every scar, every blessing. And when I come back, I promise this town won't just remember my name. It'll remember what we stood for." The applause echoed beneath the stars. The auditorium at Lincoln Heights High buzzed with anticipation. Families, faculty, and students filled every seat, dressed in their best and ready to celebrate a milestone. At the center of it all stood Malik Johnson, chosen to deliver the valedictory speech. His journey to this moment had been anything but easy, but now, standing behind the podium in his deep blue cap and gown, he carried himself with quiet strength. He took a breath and looked out over the sea of faces. His eyes found his mother, Denise, who smiled with tears already forming. He glanced toward the back, where Mr. Samuel Hartley stood by the doors, arms folded proudly. Malik began to speak, his voice steady but warm. He talked about the meaning of perseverance, not in a textbook way, but through lived experience. He told the crowd about starting school with a reputation he hadn't earned, about how people saw his background before they ever saw him. He didn't name names, didn't point fingers, but everyone knew who and what he was referencing. Then he spoke about his grandfather, Dr. Leonard Johnson, a man he had never met, but whose legacy ran through him like a current. A man who once stood for something greater than himself and who passed that strength down through generations. He believed, Malik said, pausing for a moment to compose himself, that where you come from should never determine how far you can go. The room grew quiet. Even the restless younger siblings, fidgeting in the crowd, seemed to still. Malik's words weren't grand or polished, but they were true. He spoke of Miss Blake's early doubts, the struggles with Brandon Keller, the long nights filled with doubt, but he also spoke of the people who saw him. Alicia Moore, who challenged him to dream bigger. Dean Grayson, who had looked him in the eye and told him he belonged at Harvard. And of course, Mr. Hartley, the janitor who had taught him that dignity isn't about a title, but about character. I used to think the world was against me, Malik said toward the end. Now I see some parts were. But there were people who fought beside me too. And those people, those moments, they're why I'm here. When he stepped back from the microphone, the room erupted into applause, not polite clapping, but something deeper. It was the sound of recognition, of respect. Ms. Veronica Blake, sitting beside Principal Grant, dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Even Brandon Keller, standing among his peers, looked genuinely moved. As the cheers echoed off the gymnasium walls, Malik stood tall. He hadn't just earned a diploma. He had earned his place. The campus of Harvard buzzed with its usual early fall rhythm bicycles zipping past under amber-colored trees, students with earbuds rushing between lecture halls, and professors chatting in courtyards. Malik Johnson had dreamed of this moment for years, but now that he was finally here, suitcase in hand and heart pounding, it felt surreal. His mother had hugged him tightly at the train station back in Chicago, whispering how proud his grandfather would have been. That thought stayed with Malik during the entire ride. Now, standing in the middle of Harvard Yard, he felt the weight of history, his family's, and his own settling on his shoulders. Orientation week was a blur. He met students from all over the country, even a few from overseas. Some came from wealth, some from legacy families, and many seemed completely unaware of what it took for someone like Malik to be here. But instead of feeling out of place, he remembered Mr. Hartley's words. You don't need to blend in to belong. And with that reminder, he walked with purpose. On the second day of classes, he received his schedule. One of his required lectures would take place in a building across the river, Johnson Hall. The name barely registered at first, but when he arrived, breath catching from climbing the stairs, he stopped cold. There it was, engraved in bronze on the tall stone wall, Leonard Johnson Lecture Hall, in honor of Dr. Leonard Johnson, educator, advocate, visionary. Malik froze. For a moment, the noise of students around him faded into the background. He stepped closer, tracing the edge of the plaque with his eyes. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a shared last name. It was him, his grandfather, the man he'd never met, whose framed photo had sat on their living room shelf like a quiet guardian. He stood there for several minutes, not moving, as if the plaque held a secret only he could understand. His grandfather had walked these halls. He had taught in this very space. And now, Years later, his grandson would sit here, not as an outsider, but as part of the story. A student passing by asked if he was okay. Malik smiled and nodded, his voice quiet. "Yeah," he said, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He walked inside, the sunlight casting long shadows through the tall windows. As he took his seat near the front of the lecture hall, he didn't feel small anymore. He felt connected, rooted in something far bigger than himself. Malik knew the journey wasn't over, but in that moment, he carried more than just books. He carried a legacy. And with every step forward, he would honor it. The story of Malik Johnson is a powerful reminder that true potential often lies hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone to believe in it. For older American audiences, many of whom have witnessed decades of social change, Malik's journey offers a moving reflection on perseverance, mentorship, and quiet strength. His experience reminds us that dignity and character are not defined by background or wealth, but by integrity and determination. In life, we may encounter those who are underestimated or overlooked, perhaps even ourselves in earlier years. Malik's story encourages us to recognize the power of kindness and guidance. It shows how one person's support, like Mr. Hartley's, can redirect a life and spark lasting transformation. As we age, we carry the unique opportunity to be that guiding light for the next generation by listening, encouraging, and standing up for what's right. In doing so, we not only honor our values, but help shape a more just and compassionate world.